Because knitting is handmade, one stitch at a time, even if you're a super experienced knitter, you're always gonna have a mistake or two in your projects. And when you're more of a beginner, you're probably gonna have more mistakes. Some cultures believe that on every project you should leave at least one mistake to let your soul escape through it. Whether you believe that or not, it doesn't mean that you have to leave a mistake every time you find one in your project. There are ways to fix them. So in this video, I'm gonna walk you through some of the most common mistakes and how to address them. Number one, drop stitches. And this is a mistake that is just like the name says, when you accidentally drop a stitch from your needle, a live stitch, as we say, a stitch that you should be knitting. You might notice it on the row that you're working on as you go, that stitch was dropped, or even a few rows back. And first of all, don't panic. This happens sometimes, especially when you're a beginner knitter. And then we can fix that. This is actually a very easy thing to fix. So I'm gonna show you how to do that. What happens when you drop a stitch? So let's say I'm working on this sample, and instead of knitting the stitch, I accidentally dropped it. So it now looks like this. Of course, if you notice it before you keep going, you can always just pick it up and save it. But let's say you didn't notice. So the stitch falls through and you keep knitting, and then you realize, oh no, I dropped a stitch. So it will look something like this. And if you are on that same row where you can go back to that, there are several ways in which you can save this. First, you're gonna put your needle through that stitch, kind of identify it. And you can grab another pair of needles to do this, or you can use the same needle that you're already working on and basically find that stitch that was dropped, even if it was already like dropped a few rows below, and then you basically can put it back on your left needle. And instead of knitting from your working yarn, you're gonna grab the yarn from the row that dropped the stitch, and you're basically just gonna knit using that yarn. So now I saved that stitch. I can put it back again because we lost another stitch. And once again, you knit it using the yarn from behind. And now my stitch has been recovered and I could continue knitting. Now what happens when you've dropped the stitch but you don't notice and you kept on knitting, and then you look back and you realize that a few rows back you dropped the stitch, and maybe it looks something like this. So you've already knitted above it, and in order to get back to that row you would have to undo all these rows, and you don't want to do that. So that's okay. There are several ways in which we can fix them. One is to use a needle or a crochet hook. It can be very helpful for saving that drop stitch. So if you identify the stitch and you use like a crochet hook, it doesn't have to be a crochet hook, it could be another needle, but crochet hook just happens to be really helpful because of the little hook. So we're first going to identify the stitch where we dropped it, and we're going to see the rows of yarn behind it, maybe if you dropped it a few stitches below. So here, this was a stitch here where should have happened and it didn't. So what we're going to do is basically grab that with our crochet hook, grab that extra, and you can even use your hand and pull it forward in through that loop. So basically you create that stitch. You can also do this with needles. And now you'll see that what happens is I continue knitting and now it's kind of tight, but you can see here on the row that area in which this needle should have been going. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to leave the crochet hook, or you can use something else to kind of mark that stitch and not drop it again. And I'm going to knit up until that point where the stitch should be going. So let's just knit that. All right, so I've knit up until the point where that stitch should be going, and again you can tell because this is kind of the column or the stitch where it should be going. And so now what we knit to that point, we can see this yarn of where the area where the stitch should go. So we can easily grab that the yarn that's connecting those two stitches, and just like before, using the crochet hook to kind of insert it through and create that new stitch. I'm gonna do it again, and be careful here not to drop another stitch. Just going to put it back a little bit so it doesn't drop again. And the closer you get to the end, the tighter it's gonna be, but it's okay. We see here again, this is where it should be going. We've got my stitch. So once again, I'm gonna grab it with the hook and just kind of gently insert it through my stitch. And now I've managed to get the stitch all the way up. I can put it back on my left needle, and we've successfully saved that stitch that was dropped, and I can continue knitting like normal. And you can see how it's basically, you can't tell where it was that I dropped it because I just put it back into place. So that's a very easy way of picking up drop stitches, no matter where in your work you drop them. The farther down, of course, the more you have to pick back up, and it might be a little tight, but it is savable. The next common mistake is having the wrong number of stitches or miscounting stitches. Again, this is one that happens way more often when you're a beginner, even in very simple projects, because as you're learning which stitches are live and where you are on your project, sometimes you just might accidentally create a new stitch, or if you drop a stitch and you didn't notice, you might also have less stitches. So if you dropped it, go back to the dropping stitches tutorial. If you didn't drop any stitch and you can't even find what happened, again, sometimes maybe you accidentally knit two together or you accidentally made a new stitch. So that happens. First of all, if this is happening to you a lot, I recommend that you do count your stitches every few rows. It might be a little annoying, but until you feel more confident, you should be making sure that you have the number of stitches that you're supposed to have. If you're a little bit more advanced and you have increases or decreases in your pattern, also make sure that at the end of a row with increases or decreases that you're counting the number of stitches so that you actually have the correct kind, so that later on you don't realize like, oh, I've been knitting this whole time with the wrong number of stitches. But if you do catch your project with a number of stitches that's wrong, there are several things you can do. You could, on the next row, if you have an extra stitch, you could knit together and the first two stitches and then just kind of continue. Or if you have one stitch less, you can make one stitch on the next row. It's not going to be exactly perfect, and you might be able to see that make one or two stitch two together in your pattern, but depending on how much you want it to look perfect, it might be okay. If you are off by more stitches, or if you really don't want it to be visible, you then have the option of frogging. And frogging is just a word that we use for basically undoing your work. And first thing I'm going to say is that frogging happens to all of us. It is better to frog while you're in the middle of a project and you caught the mistake, rather than until you finish the entire thing and then you realize your stitches were off or something else was off, and now you can't even wear the garment that you spent so much time making. And I have done that mistake. I have made entire projects just to realize something was off, and I have frogged entire projects. If you want to watch a video when I tell you what happened one time when I frogged an entire project and how I reused the yarn to make something else, I do have a project that happened a few years ago and that I posted about it. You don't have to undo your entire project. You can basically just go back to wherever in your project you feel like you were fine. You can count the stitches on an area below, and if you don't know how to count knitted stitches, I can show you really quickly. To count the stitches on your work, if you are working on stockinette, you want to look at the little V's that are being created on your work. So like these upside down V's, each one of these is a stitch. If you want to make sure that you have the right number of stitches, or that you want to go down somewhere where you have the right number of stitches, again, you can count them by looking at these V's. So if we have this V here, would be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, etc. So each one of these V's is going to be a stitch. So that's how you kind of count the stitches. And so once you identify a part of your project where you are sure that you have the right count of stitches, you can go back to that. You could just take your needles off and frog and then pick the stitches back up. The only thing about doing that is that you run the possibility of accidentally dropping a stitch, or having to fix more, and it's a little bit annoying. So Another way in which knitters, whenever they made a mistake and they want to go down to something, kind of make sure that you're not going to drop stitches, is with something called a lifeline. So a lifeline is basically using either another needle or a piece of yarn to catch the stitches in the area where you're going to frog to. So you basically go with your needle all throughout those stitches below, and then you frog. And by the end of the frogging, you should be in that row. So this can be a little bit tricky, so I'll show you how to do it. For a lifeline, you're going to need some scrap yarn, preferably in a contrast color, and a tapestry needle or needle that you can use to weave your ends, the same type of needle. So what you're going to do is find first what row you're going to knit back to. So this is if you want to frog to a certain part, but you don't want to like lose those stitches. So let's say we want to knit up to this row. Which again, each V is a stitch, and we're gonna find like the horizontal line of where the row is. So we're going to start just by inserting in the middle of those V's. We're going to insert our needle and go kind of horizontally all through the row, making sure we stay straight. So as you can see that I'm picking up the straight row, just right down the middle of those stitches. And then once I run out of space, you can pull it through, and you'll see how that lifeline is now kind of pulling through those stitches and holding them in place. So let's continue to the end of the row. You gotta make sure you get all of the stitches. So once you pull it through, you see how I got the entire row of stitches. And what we're gonna do is simply remove our needle and frog it. So pull those stitches down to the lifeline. And as you can see now, our lifeline is holding all of our stitches. I missed one stitch, and that when you miss that one stitch, no longer holding it, but it's holding most of the stitches. Now I can reinsert my needle through those stitches and pick up basically where I left off. And that way I don't lose any stitches after I frog. Lifelines can be useful not only when you have the wrong number of stitches, but also if you end up knitting more than you intended. So for example, in a recent project, I talk about how I knitted my sleeves a little too long and I finished them. And then when I blocked them, they were too long. So what I did is I simply frogged back using a lifeline. I frogged back to the correct length and finished it off, and it was fine. So you can use a lifeline for that. You can also, if you're about to start a part of your project that you're not feeling so sure about, that you're not and quite understanding the instructions, that you know you might have to frog if something goes wrong, you can always place a lifeline as you go. So to do that, you basically, before you knit your next row, you place the lifeline and then you continue knitting. And so that way, if you have to frog, you'll be fine later. You know that you can go back to that row. And if you don't have to frog, you simply take out the lifeline and you keep going. So in that case, you can anticipate it by adding a lifeline before you knit that section. So what you would do is, before knitting the next part, you would bring in your needle with your scrap yarn and just pull it through all of those stitches that are currently live on your needle. So you just pull it through all the way, kind of just through the same stitches that are currently on the needle, and you're just gonna continue knitting like normal, leaving that there and not touching it. So it will look something like this. And then on the next row, I basically ignore that lifeline, which is why it's helpful that it is a different color so that you don't get confused. And then I'm just gonna start knitting like normal my next row. And so you're just careful not to knit through the lifeline. So as you keep going, you will see that lifeline there, and you can keep going as far as you want. If you, as you go, decide to go back and frog to where that lifeline is, you can simply pull your stitches out of your needle and frog, and it'll once again hold your stitches in place and you won't lose any of them. So that's why it's called a lifeline, because it saves you. So if after you finish knitting you never end up using your lifeline, all you gotta do is pull it out. So you just pull it from one side and now it's gone and it's as if it was never there. So lifelines are very helpful for avoiding mistakes or be prepared for mistakes or for undoing mistakes. What happens if you finish your entire project and it's a garment and you like how it looks but maybe it's a tiny bit too small? Even with something that's not a garment, like a scarf or a blanket, it's just like, oh, not significantly, not crazy small, but just a tiny bit. Or the drape looks a little off, or, it just doesn't quite fit the way you intended it to. Well, my question then will always be, have you blocked it? And I know I've talked about blocking before, and sometimes beginners don't know about blocking. Blocking is a technique in knitting to finish your knitting, to finish your garment. And basically what it does is either there are two types of blocking, wet blocking and steam blocking, as far as I know. And I like wet blocking. Basically what it means is you put your project in water, depending on the fiber that you're using, but generally wet blocking is put it in water, you let the fibers kind of soak that water, you carefully wring it out, all the water as much as you can, and then you place it on a towel or on a mat or something where it will dry out. And once the fibers relax using the water, especially when you're using something like wool, cotton, and a lot of natural fibers, the fibers will relax with the water, and then you are able to reshape it a little bit and even stretch it out. And in fact, you should expect it to stretch it out a little bit, because basically those fibers were really tight, and with the water they kind of expand a little bit and they become relaxed. And usually what this does is, if you have lace, the lace is going to be more visible. If the drape's a little tight, the drape is probably going to look nicer. And if it's a little bit tight, you're going to gain some length. Once you finish a project, if it's a tiny bit small, before you give up and think like, I messed it up and I have to start over, try blocking your project first and see how it looks afterwards. So once it's completely dry out, the garment is going to hold that shape depending on the fiber. This doesn't work very well for acrylic. If you're using acrylic yarn, sometimes you can do steam blocking, but it won't work as well as with natural yarns like wool, alpaca, cotton, etc. So a little trick that sometimes even if you made a mistake or you feel like you didn't quite got the right size, try blocking and then see how it looks. Now the other way around though is a little bit trickier. If your project is too large, it's kind of hard to shrink it down. And in fact, I would not advise on trying to shrink it down. Sometimes people will tell you, well, if it's wool, you can put it in the dryer very carefully, and the dryer will shrink things down, but it will also felt them. So I don't recommend doing that. And if you block it, it'll just be larger. So honestly, if something's a little too large, you might want to frog and start over, which is not ideal. So my recommendation is that even if you got the right gauge, even if everything seems fine, try on your project a few times while you're working on it and catch those mistakes early. The earlier you catch mistakes, the easier it's going to be to fix them. And then the last piece of advice I'm going to give you about mistakes in knitting is to let go a little bit. Maybe listen to the old wives' tale, and if you find one mistake, don't, think too much about it. If it's not super visible, probably nobody else would notice. I tend to be a perfectionist, so this is some advice that I have to take myself. But sometimes, I am like, you know what? I had a mistake a few rows back. It's not mega visible. I can live with it. And it really helps to let go of that perfectionism a little bit. And that sometimes if you had a one purl where it shouldn't have been, it's probably fine. You don't have to undo all of your hard work. So I guess the advice here would be to kind of be able to decide, pick and choose which mistakes are more important and which you can probably let go. So like one little stitch that maybe is in the wrong place or that you did the wrong stitch, you can probably live with that. Or if you have one extra stitch or one less stitch, you can probably do that quick fix. But if you have something like a sizing mistake or something's too long, too short, doesn't end up fitting the way that you intended it to fit, then maybe that's something to consider and find that mistake and fix it. Just having that clarity of when to go for it and when to let it go really helps with enjoying knitting more and not really struggling with it all the time. So I hope you enjoyed this video. Let me know if there are other mistakes that happen to you often that you would like me to talk about and address. And otherwise, please follow, because I will be making a lot more videos coming up. I know it's the summer, a lot of you maybe not knitting, but I also have sewing projects, vintage projects that I am about to work on, and a lot of really exciting things coming up. So stay tuned and happy knitting!